Yeah, so we started the recording. So as usual, you're all welcome to make comments, constructive comments preferably, and ask questions. But everything you say is is part of the recording, and these recordings will go on the on our YouTube channel as well, and be available online for different people to listen into. So this week, the title of the session is Understanding Purchase Lease Options, because quite a lot of people are talking about purchase lease options. In reality, a couple of initial takeaways. Purchase lease option doesn't exist. It's only what people like in property are saying, I've done a purchase lease option, or I'm thinking of doing a purchase lease option. Because in practice, what we're going to see is what it really means is we're negotiating with a property owner simultaneously a lease on a property, so taking control of the property and paying a monthly amount over a fixed period of time, and simultaneously we are agreeing what's called a legal option to purchase, which enables us to purchase, and it basically requires the owner to sell it at a pre-agreed price over a specific period of time. But in practice, what we're going to be looking at is some of the key sort of like legal terms and things like what's exchange, what's completion, what is a lease, what is an option to purchase. Because at the end, and we're also going to bring in something called delayed completion. We're going to introduce the different terms. And at the end of the day, a creative deal is doing different things with these different possibilities. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, so it's called overview of purchase lease options. Yeah, saying that UK property market is known for its complexity. There are things complex, and there are some like clever nuanced things that we can do, which are perfectly legal. Obviously, if we're using solicitors that have got good experience in what they're doing. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I lost that. Need to go back to the beginning again. Yes, so there are lots of possibilities that we can do under UK property law. In fact, we shouldn't say UK property law. In reality, we should say English and Welsh property law, or Scottish property law, which is a bit different. There are Scottish variants on the same theme, but it's not exactly the same because things don't take place in the same way. Just one moment, I need to get this so it's showing. Yeah, sorry for that. We're back on track. Just one moment, I'm missing a... Just give me one moment, please. I'm missing a slide. Yes, this is the one. Do we all see this now? Yeah. So what I wanted to talk about are these different things. In reality, maybe I'm going to ask a question, see if everyone's awake. What do you think is the odd one out of these five? 4 of them belong to the same like sort of group of things, and 1 of them is an odd one. It's not like in the same group. Who wants to have a guess on that?
Is it the option to purchase?
No.
Okay. Ding, I'm out.
Anyone else?
Is it lease?
No.
No.
Any other takers? Well, there's only 3 left now, aren't there?
The completion.
Sorry?
The completion.
No.
Right?
We're not doing too well here, are we?
No, we're not. I'm going to tell you actually. So in fact, it's delayed
Respect for
completion. The reason is why delayed completion is the odd one out is because exchange is a specific legal process. So that's when we exchange contracts between a buyer and a seller, and we sign normally it's done like remotely, we sign via the solicitors. And when we exchange contracts, that means we've entered into a legally binding contract and we have to buy a property. Typically, we're paying 10% deposit, which goes to the solicitors. And if we pull out of the deal, we'll lose that deposit that will go to the seller, and the seller can take legal action against us to force us to buy or to get damages if we don't go ahead. So exchange is a legal mechanism. Completion is a legal mechanism. Completion is when we've exchanged contracts and when finally we make the final payment and do all the remaining paperwork, then we become the legal owner of a property. So that's completion. It's like a legal thing. Lease is also a legal agreement. A lease, obviously, we know approximately what that is. A lease is a legal agreement when we have an agreement with a property owner to rent for a determined period of time, typically a few years, the property, and then there's different conditions, who repairs what, how much we're paying, and different clauses. So that is a legal agreement. An option to purchase is also a legal agreement. So that's a specific legal agreement that's signed with the solicitors. So when we sign a option to purchase, that means that the owner of a property is committing to sell the property at a pre-agreed price and for a predetermined period of time. So let's say we have an option to purchase that's for 24 months at £500,000. At any point in time, the person that has the option to purchase, so that's the buyer, can say to the seller, I'm ready to buy, I'm going to pay £500,000 and you have to complete and sell me the property. And that is legally binding. And if the owner doesn't agree to that sale, he can be legally forced to sell. So the common thing are these 4 things, because they're all legal things. When we talked about delayed completion, normally when we're buying a house, so if we're buying a house to live in, so normal house purchase when we maybe start on the property ladder or we're upscaling, normally the exchange and completion will take place on the same day. So what happens, all the contracts are prepared, everything is ready, and exchange and completion, we don't even realize that there's 2 separate things because they take place at the same time. Whereas in practice, from a legal point of view, when we exchange contracts, at the point at which we exchange, we're going to determine and specify when we complete the sale. And it's quite possible and feasible for the completion to be several months or even several years after exchange. So that means that there's a legally binding contract and in delayed completion. the actual completion, so physical transfer of ownership, will take place at some point in the future. So delayed completion isn't in itself a legal like term and something that we do at the solicitors, whereas the other four things are legal things that we do at the solicitors. Obviously, initially when we did this slide, we put things like with arrows, but obviously there are some dependencies. We can't complete on a purchase if we haven't exchanged contracts. So obviously exchange and completion have to be in this order. We can, yes, someone asked a question? No questions? Okay. Yeah, probably that's Sal doing his cooking. Yeah, so yeah, we can't complete before exchanging. If we talk about a lease can take place at any point in time we want. So we can do a lease on a property without exchanging, without completing, at any point in time. So that can be anywhere on the time scale. And also an option to purchase can be done also at any point in time. An option to purchase is like, in reality, it's a contract. So an option to purchase in reality is similar, is a conditional exchange. So it's an exchange, there's a contract, but it's conditional. The seller has to sell, but the buyer doesn't have to buy. So yeah, and we can like do a mix and do things in different ways. And often when we talk about exchange, we're always thinking that 10%, there's a 10% deposit at exchange. That is common practice, but it doesn't have to be 10%. It can be more and it can be less. So we can do an exchange with 1% or 5% deposit and agree to complete later.
Trevor, can I ask you a question about the what you just said a moment ago about the exchange and the similarities with option to purchase?
Mhm.
So what I understand is that you can have an exchange subject to certain criteria, right?
That's right, yes.
But the understanding is that an exchange subject to criteria is a stronger contract than a simpler option to purchase, simply because the idea is that if the criteria aren't fulfilled, they expect to be fulfilled at some point. So am I misunderstanding, right? Is it, could you have an exchange subject to criteria, which is basically something then that you can, let's say it's planning permission as an example, right? If you don't get satisfactory planning permission, I'd be using language that I want to have the right to buy, but unless I get the planning permission that I need, that I want, I won't purchase, right? So to me, I would indicate that's an option to purchase. If I say exchange subject to certain criteria and I don't get the planning permission, well, I kind of,
Yeah.
is
In
there
reality, when we're talking about exchange, and
yeah,
this is like a key thing, when we're talking about exchange, it's generally like sort of equal on both sides. So if we exchange, even if there's conditions, that means that if those conditions are satisfied, you as a purchaser are obliged to purchase. And if you don't purchase, you lose your deposit and the seller can go after you for damages and force you to complete.
yep,
When we've got an option to purchase, the buyer, which sometimes is more complicated and more difficult to negotiate, and that makes perfect sense. If I'm selling something, yes, I might have advantages in agreeing to an option to purchase on my property, but that doesn't give me the assurance that I'm going to sell my property. Whereas, so sometimes we're able to get over the line with a prospective seller and exchange with in exchange subject to condition and with delayed completion, because that means for the seller, if those conditions are satisfied, he's sure that he's going to sell the property.
I mean, like, so I believe that makes sense, but I just if I play it back to you though, the exchange with criteria shouldn't be criteria that is what's like intractable necessarily, or it's a binary thing one way or another, like planning permission, right? You wouldn't want to do an exchange subject to criteria on the basis of successful planning permission, because you're potentially going to be chased for damages if you don't get the planning permission. But you might want to enter into the exchange subject to criteria if there is a tenant or sitting tenant, and you say, well, I want to exchange subject to vacant possession, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you can still do it subject to planning permission, but that's generally more complicated.
Yes.
And generally, if we're doing something subject to planning, like for example, we're looking at the moment a development site in Sutton in Surrey, and because it's quite a long period of time to get the planning, we're looking on there basically be an option to purchase over a period of 24 months.
Yeah,
But
that would
there
make
is
sense.
a consideration given in order to, when there's an option to, obviously we've got slides on each of these, but this is like sort of a general overview, and then we'll just run through the slides or leave people to have a look at them in their own time. But when we talk, an option to purchase is only valid if there is an initial consideration, so that means money, given to the owner of the property. Now, it is possible for that option to be purchase to be with a consideration of £1. Generally, that's the case. So when we talk about purchase lease options, what in reality we're talking about is an option to purchase accompanied with a lease that runs at the same time. Because the option to purchase doesn't give us control or ownership of a property. However, if we negotiate a lease at the same time, and we do that simultaneously, and we do it with the same solicitors, on the same day that we have the option to purchase, we start a lease, which will generally be for the same period as the option to purchase. So if we've agreed an option to purchase over 5 years, we'll also take a lease on the property over 5 years. So the owner of the property will receive either a monthly or a quarterly payment from us for the lease. And the owner of the property will receive an initial payment for the option. In the case, obviously, when a owner agrees an option, he's basically taking his property off the market because he can't sell it to someone else because the investor has got an option to purchase. And generally, they're not going to do that for nothing. And so either we've got a good solid lease and they're getting good income from the lease, or, and sometimes it'll be coupled, we'll agree a upfront payment of a few thousand or maybe 10,000, depending on the price of the property, and all this enters into the negotiation. So yeah, we've got different possibilities. So yeah, the key thing is to understand what each of these things are, and then to creatively make proposals and discussions with the with the owners. And obviously these things here, maybe we understand them or we can understand them. A lot of property owners are not at all familiar with what these terms are. So we need to be able to explain these in clear language, explain how they work, and obviously also explain to the person that has a property that, look, we've got our solicitors that are specialized in this, and either we can help you find, or our solicitors can explain to your solicitors how it works and give people the assurance that they need. Anyway, let's move on to some of the individual slides that give more details. So what is exchange? So exchange of contracts, it's basically when a buyer and seller swap signed contracts, and that becomes legally binding. What is interesting for people who maybe are familiar or have purchased property outside of the UK, such as, for example, on the continent. I lived in France for a period of time and did quite a bit of property transactions there. There is a bit different that you do it with a notary rather than with solicitors. But the big difference there is almost from the outset, there's a legally binding contract between the buyer and the seller at the same time, whilst all the searches and all the different things are being done. And obviously that initial contract is subject to conditions. If you find like strange things about the property, it's possible to pull out, but that gives a lot more security to the buyer and the seller. In in the UK specifically, like in England, we know very well that we can do all the searches, spend a lot of money on solicitors, be 6 months down the line, and until there's that legal exchange, both either the seller or the buyer can completely pull out of the deal, and there's no legal recourse for damages or compensation. So yeah, that can go like in our favor and against us, but we need to be aware of the fact that just because a seller has accepted our offer and we've got, if there's an agent involved, we've got what's called a memorandum of sale. A memorandum of sale is just a piece of paper effectively signed by both parties that is sent to each party's solicitors for them to start the work, but it only becomes legally binding when there is exchange of contracts. And it says here, typically the buyer pays a deposit of often 10% of the purchase price, but that is negotiable. Also, what is important is that there's, can't remember exactly what they're called, but there are standard legal documents for exchange that solicitors normally use on conveyancing. And these are like sort of predefined formats. And in these predefined formats, it'll give all like the different sequences, the rules, the percentages. But that doesn't mean to say we have to use that document if we want to agree specific terms with a seller, as long as obviously the seller is in agreement and the solicitors are happy to do something a little non-standard, then it's perfectly possible. And typically on exchange, it's going to specify in what delay, so by what time, by what date is needed to complete, and then we can complete any time up until that that date. Completion is the final stage, and it's a completion where there is transfer of ownership from the seller to the buyer, and we get the keys to the property. So this means that if we're doing exchange with delayed completion, but we want to have access to the property and deal with it, renovate it, potentially benefit from rental income, either we have to include in the exchange contract the fact that from exchange we have use of the property and responsibility, for example, for insuring and maintaining the property, but the ownership is still with the original owner. Or we do like a more standard exchange and we agree a lease. Here is not an option to purchase. We are agreeing a lease for the period of the delayed completion. So both options are possible, and depending on the case, we'll choose the one that we want to use. So this is like, summary of completion. What is a legal option to purchase? So this is another specific agreement. So a legal option to purchase is agreement granting a prospective buyer the right, but not the obligation, to buy a property at a future date for an agreed price. Generally, the way that we will get this over the line is A, it has to be a seller that is selling the property and they don't immediately need the money. So if they, for example, have got some debt that they need to pay off and they need to sell the property to do that, then there's no point in trying to negotiate or propose an option to purchase. If, however, the owner doesn't need all of the money straight away and is happy to wait some time, typically the way that we're going to approach that is we're going to understand, and we don't do this at the first meeting, obviously. We'll do this maybe the second or the third meeting. We'll start like discussing and looking at this. We'll understand from the seller if there's a mortgage on the property, what are their mortgage payments, how much money potentially they need straight away because of debts or things that they need to pay, and how much money they can wait for down the line. And then we'll come up with some proposal that fits those terms. And what we're sort of saying to them, look, maybe let's say the property's worth market value is 500,000, but they've only had offers up to, let's say, 400,000, because it's like difficult to sell, maybe difficult conditions, or the property isn't in great condition. We're going to say, look, we can potentially buy your property straight away at 400,000. However, if you agree an option to purchase, we'll cover your mortgage payments through a lease. We'll take the property off your hands and look after it, keep it in good condition, or maybe do some renovation, probably have it tenanted, or maybe you do serviced accommodation with it. And we'll say, look, in this case, we can offer you a higher price. So we can offer you the 500 that you're asking for, or if we're looking like at a fairly long period of time, we can say we can offer you up to potentially 540,000. But that option, we're going to have that for 5 years, for example. And so explaining during those 5 years, we'll be paying you this much per month. So we've got the lease that runs with the option to purchase. We'll be covering your mortgage, and we'll be giving you, if we do buy it, we'll be giving you this amount of money anytime up to 5 years. And the person selling can be quite happy with that. If their mortgage is covered, they don't need the money. And also what they understand as well, you might say, why would someone accept that? Because also, generally, we would be agreeing to potentially renovate the property. So they know that we're putting some money into the property. We're going to be increasing its value. So in practice, and they're getting like the ongoing monthly income from the lease. So if we don't exert the option to purchase, it's not necessarily going to be a big deal for them, because potentially the property is going to be worth even more than the option to purchase, and they can put it back on the market and find a seller for it. And sometimes we'll explain that as well. We'll say, look, we're giving we're going to take care of it. We're going to increase its value, but we want to have the option to purchase. And seller can agree that. Sometimes if that's difficult, or the seller needs more assurance, and we're sure that we're going to be able to add sufficient value to be able to purchase it in a specific point of time in the future, then we'll be looking more at exchange with delayed completion and giving the owner the assurance that we're going to buy it. Yeah, so the option to purchase is simply, legal option to purchase. And quite often, if we look at the next one, I think it's going to be, what is a lease? Is we're having a lease on the property at the same time. Yeah, so lease, contractual agreement where one party pays the other for the use of an asset, such as a property. Obviously here we're talking about properties for a specific period, so either residential or commercial leases. And these documents are, obviously there are models, but if we're doing this coupled with an option to purchase, we'll have the solicitors draw up both the lease and the option to purchase. because also the lease generally is going to specify what we're allowed to do with the property. Because in a lot of cases, when we're doing an option to purchase, we also want to, for example, we might be converting house into an HMO. We might be doing some commercial to residential conversion, and that lease must allow us to do that during the period of the lease and change, for example, apply for planning, change use of something, basically do everything that we need to do to be able to add sufficient value so that by the time we get to the point where we exercise the option to purchase, we've added enough value so that we can either sell the property and make our money from it, or we can go to the bank, get finance on it, which will cover the actual payment that we need to make for the option. So that's obviously what a lease is. So what is delayed completion? I think we've more or less covered that. That's when we exchange, but we're not going to complete the same day or the same week. And it can be several months. And yeah, it gives security to the owner. They're sure that we're going to buy it, and if we don't buy it, they take our deposit and can get more from us. And it's the same thing in reality. I'm just going from one thing to another, but when you buy a property in auction, buying a property in auction is in reality exchange with delayed completion. The moment the hammer goes down and your bid is accepted, that in fact is equivalent of legal exchange of contracts. And on the exchange of contracts, on the auction contract, the completion must take place typically within 28 days. So you're paying the deposit, the 10%, and your auction fees on exchange, which is at the when the bid is accepted, and then there's 28 days to raise the remaining 90% and complete the purchase through the solicitors. But yeah, delay completion, it can be 4 or 5 years. Everything is possible if the different parties agree with each other. So combining a lease with an option to purchase, we've already said what that is, and that's what people commonly call a purchase lease option. Obviously, you've got the words purchase, lease, and option in it, but in reality, yeah, it's a lease done simultaneously with an option to purchase. So here, in fact, the tenants and landlords is not quite so applicable because we're speaking more about vendor and seller. So yeah, and the same here. In fact, I didn't reread these slides. Yeah, benefit of lease option agreements. In fact, yeah, the buyers are not really the tenants. The buyers are the investors in this case. So if we're investors and we're looking to get into property, a lease with option to purchase can be a great way of getting hold of a property with a really small amount of money. Yeah, so basically entering into a lease option agreement typically requires a smaller upfront payment compared to a traditional property purchase. So it's possible in some cases to agree that for £1, plus obviously the solicitor's fees. And generally, we can't pay directly the seller's legal fees because that will be a conflict of interest. But we can, if we've sort of agreed an option at £1, we can say, look, we'll cover to the seller, we'll cover your legal fees. And in order to do that, we'll say, instead of an option at £1, we'll put the option at £3,000, for example, which is typically the cost for a solicitor to deal with a lease and option to purchase. So for the buyer, for the investor, that gives time to arrange finance. Basically, yeah, gives time to add value to the property and get to a point where it's possible to refinance and with that refinance, pay the owner for the property. And for the seller, so for the vendor, which could be the current owner of the property, is giving them regular income from the lease agreement. If they've got a mortgage, then that is covering the mortgage. Just as an aside, when we do these agreements, we normally organize it so that in practice we're not paying the current owner. We've got an agreement where we're directly paying the owner's bank their mortgage payments, because we don't want to get into a situation where we're paying the vendor's got financial problems, and instead of paying for the mortgage, they're sort of using the money for other things that they need it for. And then in the end, the bank is coming and repossessing the property. So to avoid these problems, it's important to have direct payment of mortgage. And then obviously generally the lease agreement, the amount we're paying to the owner is more than the mortgage, and then the difference we'll be paying directly.
So, Trevor, because of that, do you need permission from the seller's lender to enter into a lease option agreement?
You don't need the permission to enter into the agreement, but you need their permission to pay directly the mortgage payments.
Yeah.
And for the lender to accept those mortgage payments on behalf of the vendor.
So that's the conversation you need to have, but you don't need to say we're doing this because of a lease option agreement.
No.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but that is actually, it is important to take into account mortgage. And obviously as well, when we set up the lease option agreements, we're checking all the potential security that is registered against the property. So first charge from lender, any second charge, and any, for example, standard stuff, like we're always looking, are there any enforcement notices served on the property? Is there anything else attached to that title? So in reality, when we do a lease option agreement, if we're doing it properly, which we should be, unless like it's £1 and we're prepared to take that risk, we're doing basically everything we do when we're doing a normal purchase of a property, and making sure that everything is fine, so that the day that we want to actually exerts that option to purchase, we've already done all those searches. In practice, we'll have to do those searches again, because they searches generally only valid for 3 months, but we've done them. We know there's not going to be any surprises down the line. And we'll also obviously take the necessary dispositions so that the vendor cannot register or have registered additional charges against the property. So yeah, we take disposition. So that will be, I can't remember, it's an RX something that we're going to stick on the land registry, so that no one else, so that the owner can't go and say, for example, get a second charge mortgage against the property. So that when we come to buy it, we find that we've got 2 mortgages and additional loans and stuff to pay off. So all that we're sorting out with the solicitors. When we normally, the solicitor's obviously going to think about that, but we're going to confirm with them. And when we like mandating them, we'll say, we want you to check all of this stuff as well. So a lot of benefits of these lease option agreements, both on the side of the tenant or the basically the current owners, on the buyers and the sellers. Legal considerations in lease option agreements. Obviously make it clear who has responsibility for maintaining things, who's dealing with the insurance, what are the agreed purchase price and terms, and for how long. And yeah, this thing here, enforceability. Legal options are perfectly valid legal agreements, but there are a number of terms that need to be done and set up properly. So this means don't use like standard solicitors who don't have experience of that. Use specific, let's say, property-based solicitors who have good experience of doing options to purchase and lease agreements. And this thing here, independent legal advice for both parties. If the person selling hasn't taken independent legal advice, he can claim down the line that he didn't know what the agreement that he was entering into, and he can potentially get out of it. Which is why as well, generally, when we're going into a mortgage, or especially a commercial mortgage, the lenders always require us to take independent legal advice so that we can't later try and get out of it by saying we didn't know what we were doing. So, example of created deal using a purchase lease option. But I think in fact we've already spoken about that, so that's fairly clear. Practical example is that, yeah, we agree a future purchase price on a property generally higher than what the owner will get straight away. We agree the lease so that the owner is getting some income during that period, and a future value for the option. And then at some point in time during the process, we're going to exercise that option, especially if we're doing something where we're looking for additional planning. When we've got that planning and everything sorted out and our finance together, then we'll exercise the option and get on with the deal. And then the final thing is that there is completion of the sale and the ownership of the property and transfers from the vendor to the buyer. Risks and mitigation strategies. The main risks in reality on all these things are, well, market fluctuation. So we agree a future price and the market goes down. Obviously, property market generally is going up with small dips and then continuing to go up. So as long as we've given ourselves sufficient amount of time and we're not like sort of buying or agreeing a price that's at the top of a curve, then generally mitigating against that. And then the other thing is being very clear on the legal terms, make sure everything is drafted and done properly by using not obviously, it's not a question of qualified or not qualified solicitors, because all solicitors, if they're registered, are qualified, but a question of using ones that have experience in doing these type of contracts. And the due diligence is also the same, whatever property project we're doing, check properly the end values based on sold comparables, and make sure that we've got a good deal and that we've checked all the figures. We're going to skip this one. Obviously, there are recent changes on leasehold, but this is actually not the type of leases that we're talking about on leases and option to purchase. These are like the standard leases on residential properties. And yeah, that is the main content for today. So let's open it up for any questions.
So Trevor, the legal advice that you both need to take, can you recommend a solicitor to the seller that you know is not acting for you, but is familiar with the option agreement process?
Yes, and that is actually a common thing that we do.
Okay. Yeah.
We're recommending, but we're saying obviously we're not like saying you must use that solicitor. So we
Yes.
can recommend one, but what we can never do is pay directly the the seller's solicitor.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
normally a seller's solicitor would never accept that. And they
Yeah.
have to take their instructions from the seller. So basically, as soon as we recommended them, then there must be there's going to be no contact between us and the seller's solicitor. The only contact will be with our solicitor and the seller's solicitor.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Just a question, Trevor, about the purchase lease options agreements. Can sellers like pull out of the deal if they found that their property increased in value by a significantly more than obviously the price that they agreed?
If the option is done properly, then they can't pull out.
Okay. So you got to make sure that the agreement's properly written, I guess.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, and it will be if it's done by obviously someone that
Solicitors.
is specialized in doing that.
Yeah.
And yeah, obviously, and that is going to happen because if
Yeah.
we're talking about a 5-year option
Mm.
and we've agreed an option at 600,000 and the market value is 700,000, obviously the seller is, I mean, he needs to understand he agreed to that, and
Yeah.
it's not for sure that it would have got to 700,000. It could have been stable and
Yeah, it stayed where it
and he's
was.
going to try and get out. He's going to say, well, you told me everything was fine, there
Yeah.
isn't a problem. You need to have everything crossed and say, well, you took independent legal advice.
Yeah.
And also say you got your just as an aside, by the way, generally the lease payments aren't offset against the purchase price. So if you've got a
Okay.
future purchase price of, let's say, this £550,000, if during the agreement the owners received typically maybe like 50,000 from the rent payments, that's not taken off the amount that we owe him for the 550. So at the
Yeah.
end, the owner's getting 50 plus the 550, so he's getting 600,000 over the period. It is possible. Everything is negotiable. If we like, for example, doing quite a lot of renovation work and adding value, we can potentially agree that the part or all of those payments will be taken off the final payment. So, and that is more the case if we're doing like exchange with delayed completion. We can agree a payment basically equivalent to a lease, and that can be considered as part of the overall consideration. In other words, the overall purchase price. And the key thing, a key takeaway at the end of the day is everything in general is possible if it makes sense and both parties agree to it.
I was going to say, Trevor, I think, is there a balancing act? Is there a trade-off between when you decide to go for a option agreement versus exchange delayed completion? Like if you're planning to do major refurbs and purchase later, is it better to do your due diligence for an exchange with delayed completion rather than an option to purchase because you're putting a significant amount of capital into the property?
I mean, I would say in reality, it doesn't really matter in the sense that if you got your option properly done,
Right.
then but at the same time, if you're putting that much money in,
Exactly.
you might as well, in inverted commas, go for the exchange with delayed completion because that's giving a bit more reassurance to the seller, and it gives you a better chance of getting the deal over the line. Because if you go to the seller saying, obviously you can use all the arguments, but saying there's the possibility I don't exercise the option, because generally we're saying we might not exercise the option, but we'll have added so much value to your property that it's fine anyway.
Yeah.
Good. We've got 3 minutes left. Does anyone else have a question?
So, Trevor, have you got I mean, you showed an example, but have you got a real world example of an option agreement that you've executed on? Have you got one you can trot out, even just verbally?
Let me think. There's one that we did, which was, yeah, basically it was purchasing a commercial property with the converting it into a large HMO. And this actually was up in Lancashire. And it was, a lease option that was run concurrently with an option to purchase. The property was in like pretty bad condition, so we actually agreed it was a 6-month period during which we didn't have to pay any rent at all, and after that it was like progressively increasing, and we agreed the option price over 5 years. At the end, we actually, and Keith, we didn't mention, whenever you're doing these agreements, we always, because in this one, actually, we sold it on, we agree an assignable, that it can be assignable. Assignable means that if we decide ourselves not to exercise the option, we can sell that option to somebody else, like so an independent investor who can come in and basically exerts the option with the original seller at the same price. So sometimes we'll do that as a way of almost as a paper exercise. We'll negotiate everything. Obviously, we're paying the legal fees and things. We're paying the option price. But then either after we've got the lease, this also means obviously we're making the lease assignable as well. Generally, when the lease is assignable, the current vendor has to be able to accept the new person. And we use the standard phrase, which is on all contracts, which must not be unreasonably withheld. You
Right.
get that in like standard rental contracts. Yes, so sometimes it can be we negotiate everything, and rather than sell it on as a deal with the aim that the investor who buys that deal will sign and do the option agreement, we actually get everything set up ourselves. That's all legally binding. The owner is signed onto it. Obviously, we've invested a few £1,000s to get that set up. And then we might decide for whatever reason we're not going to do it ourselves. We're going to find someone that is happy to pay us £10,000 or £20,000 for that deal, and we sign it to them. So, yeah, that's like an example of one.
I've realized actually that when you do an exchange with delayed completion, you're actually liable for stamp duty. Whereas if you're doing an option to purchase, you essentially defer that, don't you?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
there are those considerations involved, obviously, depending on the price of the property.
Mhm.
Right, well, thank you all for your time. I hope that was useful. And
It was, yeah.
yeah, the recording will be available for those that weren't able to take part.
All right, thanks, Trevor.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, have a good evening, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Cheers. Cheers, guys. See you soon. Take care. Bye.
Yeah.